It's absolutely okay to kill plants. It'll be fine. Nothing's gonna come of it. The worst that could happen is that you gotta do it over again. I can tell you from experience that killing plants is just not a bad thing. It's gonna happen no matter what you do. I think you just need to get used to the fact that you're gonna kill stuff. This plant is dead. Yeah, I think so. I mean, there might be a little bit of life left in there, but it's still dead. And I think you just need to be aware of the fact that your plants, some of them are gonna die, and you're not gonna be able to do much about it. And what you can do though is to prepare yourself and be ready for the fact that, hey, things are gonna die, and there's some things you can do to avoid that happening, but you know, it's one of those things where you just have to accept it and be aware that it's a thing. People don't talk about dead plants a whole lot. Today we're gonna talk about dead plants, so why don't we get into it? Hello plant fiends, I'm Nick, this is Proppist. Welcome or welcome back. Glad to have you here. Something that doesn't get talked about enough in the plant hobby is death. It happens, it's all around you. There's plants that die, plants that look bad, plants that are dying. You just don't see a whole lot of it. People don't talk about it. Today, what I'd like to talk to you about a little bit is death, plant death, and that it's a common thing and something that you can get accustomed to and be prepared for and hopefully not have to deal with as much because you've been prepared for it. So I thought we would talk maybe a bit about dead stuff, or at least about killing stuff when it comes to plants at least. Let's talk a little bit about bad conditions, non-Instagram worthy stuff, dead stumps of plants. We can talk about how you can fix it, how you can prevent it, how you can prepare yourself to be a better plant parent just by being aware of what might kill your plants. So I'm sitting here surrounded by a whole bunch of stuff that I had to move out of my guest room. This is an inspiration for this video because I thought, you know what, since I'm doing this, I may as well take a look at what's there and get a good sense of what I've been doing to my plants. Am I caring for them properly? Do I really need all these? And honestly, like, which ones are kind of bringing me joy, even though I don't really buy that whole way of thinking, but which ones make me happy? Which ones do I enjoy looking at, taking care of? And which ones do I just not care about? Or don't want to have to deal with the trouble anymore of owning. So a little bit of storytelling to explain the situation here, but my guest room, which is over there, is also a bit of my plant room. Now, the stuff that I don't keep in my grow tent lives in that room. And we recently have to move things around because my wife is taking that room as an office. And she's not nearly as into plants as I am. You can underscore that many times over. And I think we're just to be able to make her happy so she doesn't have 500 plants in her room. 500 might be a bit of an exaggeration. It's probably more like 100. This is a big family room, open space. My kids kind of play. This is, their Xbox area right where I'm sitting. This is the kind of thing where, you got to figure out what to do with these things. You're moving them around the house. Time to do a little bit of cleanup while you're at it. Maybe repot some stuff. Also, get rid of things, and I have a lot of things to get rid of. Some of it has been there for quite a while, probably like pushing 2-3 years now. Some of it is pretty new, and it's like either imports that I've brought in, or it's plants that I've brought in locally or through sellers across the country that I've brought in that I need to repot because they've been sitting, acclimating, and just kind of generally needing some care right now. Now, this is not a care video. I'm going to talk to you about dead stuff, and that's really what we're getting at here, is that dead stuff is okay. I think that's something we just don't talk about enough in plant social media circles, in plant media. I don't know what you want to call it. The big name plant YouTubers, etc. Instagram is notoriously bad for this. I think the amount of negative kind of peer pressure you get from Instagram and the plant circles is pretty bad. I sit there looking at some of these huge plants and I think to myself, like, no one ever shows anything bad. It's always the good stuff, right? I mean, that's what sells on Instagram. Now, on YouTube, I think you get a little bit more real kind of plant ownership and plant care and plant maintenance in general. And that's kind of why I like the community on YouTube a bit better. And that's really why I don't take great care of my Instagram account. And I find it really hard to post there. I have to force myself, and it's not really something that's a lot of fun, right? It feels like it's business as opposed to really enjoying it. I enjoy scrolling Instagram for the plant stuff, and I have a great list of people that I follow. But in terms of me posting, it takes effort, compared to YouTube, where I actually enjoy talking to the camera, talking to you guys, and kind of pretending that you're in the room with me while we have a chat. Now, I have a lot of alive stuff surrounding me because I kind of wanted to show you guys a little bit of an update on some of the good stuff too. And I've got this SP Morona kind of climbing down my pants over here. But I do have a bunch of mid-transition plants over here and a whole lot of dead stuff in front of me over here. And I'm going to show you the dead stuff because I think that's more important today. It's funny, as I was thinking about this and I was trying to clear some of the plants out of that room over there, I was thinking to myself, hey, you know what? I'm sure everybody has this kind of problem at some point. I was looking around on YouTube and I came across Kevin at Hakuna La Planta, one of his latest videos. I think it was entitled something like Rant. And he spent a pretty good chunk of time talking about, how people don't show torn leaves. They don't show damage very much on Instagram. And sometimes even on YouTube, you just see the good stuff. Just kind of the social media take on plants and how he had cut off some Instagram and not really read anything recently, looked at anything recently, and avoided even YouTube communities and stuff like that had to do with plants. And I get it. I mean, I think he was talking about something like a week, but I get why you would want to do that. And I understand people just don't show the bad stuff. They don't really show the crispy leaves. This is my Anthurium Dock Block F2, I believe, which is now starting to put out some nice stuff, but like it had munching by thrips. And I'm not sure if you can get a good look at that guy there, but I mean, it's got crispiness here because I forgot to water it. It's still needing a repot. It's sitting in a combination of moss with, I think it's got some LECA at the bottom here. And this is a combination I'm not going to do anymore. I really don't like the results of having the moss on top of the LECA. I find that it just stays soggy the whole time. This was an experiment. I was just testing it out to see how it would go. But I mean, it's putting out a new leaf there. I don't know if you can see that right in the middle. There is a new leaf coming. That looks pretty nice. And I mean, even the latest leaf is starting to look, you know, a little red crystal-y, which is kind of what we're getting at here. I don't really see the veining just yet, but I'm hoping like the next leaf or the one after, so this guy maybe, we'll see how this guy starts turning out. It's also growing a little weirdly, but you know, I get it. Nobody shows the bad stuff. I mean, even look at these guys. Like, I didn't take the greatest care of this plant when I originally got it. It was quite small. I think it was just these bottom 3 small leaves here. 1, 2, 3, and it's put on these other bigger leaves since I've gotten it, but I had it in open air. It really didn't like it. I believe this is the first leaf it's put on inside my tent, which is already starting to look quite nice. And you know, it's the thing, plant care takes effort, and if you're not feeling it and you're just not in a good space mentally, you tend to just let it go. And I think that that's kind of reflected by the fact that people on Instagram just show the good stuff and don't show the bad stuff. And I think Kevin's right. Like, you know, he was talking about how he got this melanochrysum that he's got is massive. I mean, the leaves are like 2 feet long. And I'm like, that's so envious of this, right? At the same time, I know where it came from. And I've watched some of his previous videos where he showed that he had acquired it with actually longer leaves than he has right now, which is quite funny. But he went through a whole process of like cutting it and trying to get it to climb, etc. And like melanochrysums can be a real bitch to try and size up, right? So when you've got your tiny melanochrysum that's like 2 inches long and you're looking at that going, oh my God, how did he get it that big? Realistically, he didn't. So he's just maintaining it that way. And I think it's a good take on his part. I wish we'd gone a little further into the deadness of things. So that's what we're going to do today, talk a little bit more about the dead stuff. I've got a few examples of plants I've killed recently or not so recently. And you can get a sense of, you know, like this is a common occurrence. It's going to happen, especially when you have a lot of plants. I've got like at least a couple hundred, I don't know, maybe more, I haven't counted. Just going by the sheer volume of stuff I've got in here, just not everything makes it. And it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Let's take a look at some of these dead plants. We can talk about the reasons for why plants die and get into a bit of like, how can you learn from this? What can you take from it to move on? What processes and procedures and things can you put in place to do a better job taking care of your plants? So I got a bit of a list here. We'll kind of go through that and we'll take a look at some of these deadites while we're at it too. The Army of Darkness throwback there, if you caught that one. Oh, and if you're concerned for Jim, he's over here. Don't worry. He's just taking a break from this video. He's just kind of sitting out on the side here, but he is here watching carefully over us. So, I mean, dead stuff in general is not a big deal. Like in commercial growing, this happens all the time, right? And what happens in commercial growing? Typically stuff gets tossed. So it's out in the organics bin, like, you know, it's out, it's gone, you're not going to see it again. And realistically, like in commercial growing for, you know, the stuff that you're seeing in your Costa farms, etc., that stuff is mostly coming from TC, you know, like I don't think they're hand propagating a whole lot. The vast majority of it is coming from TC, which means they can typically afford to lose a certain percentage of everything that comes out of there. And really what they're trying to do is just sell off all the good stuff and the bad stuff doesn't matter. And it makes up for it, right? So, I mean, I don't know what their margins are like. They can't be dramatically high. So they got to move by volume. And at that level, you're just tossing a lot of stuff out. So I would be interested to see. I've watched some YouTube channels that talk about commercial growing and how that works. But I would be interested to see the sheer volume of stuff that gets thrown out that you just never makes it to your local Walmart or Home Depot where you're buying these plants. Now, there's kind of like one rung down the ladder, right? This is the boutique plant shop. So this is, you know, your local plant store that sells some of the more high-end stuff. The stuff you won't get in the Home Depots or the Lowe's. It's the stuff that you're going to find that's, hey, you know, there's some beginner level Anthuriums like crystallinums and maybe a magnificum here and there. You'll find some of the more hard to take care of philodendrons like your melanos and your gigas and things like that floating around. And, you know, maybe a glorious to really make your life a little easier because the hybrid phyllos are just so much simpler to care for. Speaking of hybrid phyllos, I should show you real quick. This is one I acquired recently. I've got a couple of these guys in here. There's a Mandula pothos just hanging out at the top here, which is a cutting that I have not had. I haven't owned a Mandula pothos before. But this guy in here, which I think maybe I can get out of here, it's got a bit of a chonk attached to it. Let's see if you can see that leaf. Can you see that? This is a Philodendron Summer Glory, which I am looking forward to growing out. So this little Summer Glory here that I've got coming from a chonk, you can see the chonk attached there. This guy is a hybrid of Philodendron gloriosum and Philodendron Macaulay's Finale unnamed hybrid. That's what I got when I looked it up. But Macaulay's Finale, I've seen that one by itself standalone. I'll show you guys up here a picture of a fully grown mature one. It definitely has like that gloriosum style leaf, but it's a shiny kind of coppery finish to it, and it comes in kind of like an almost not quite orangey, but it's got like a coppery type of sheen to it when it comes in, and it's a crawler like gloriosum, which I'm kind of like ambivalent about which one I prefer. It's hard to find crawler pots that are good for semi-hydro, and they're expensive, so I don't mind having one that's a climber. Instead, I could just chop and prop every time it gets bigger, so kind of like the glorious for that. And I find that the gloriosum hybrids and like the varicosum hybrids, etc., and the melano hybrids, they all grow much better than your typical non-hybrid version of it. So, except the gloriosum, which is not actually terrible to grow. So that all aside, when you're dealing with a boutique plant shop, typically what they do is, like, first off, you're going to prune. They can't afford to toss plants as much as your typical huge grower can, right? So they bring stuff in, they have limited quantities, and the stuff that comes in needs to either be good quality or they're going to be down some money in the process. And I think at that point, you got to try and do what you can with the stuff you've acquired, which is like, pruning, so getting rid of dead leaves, making sure things look decent. Then, if things are looking too bad, like you've got a really leggy plant because all the leaves have dropped or something like that, you're going to have to then chop and prop. Hopefully you can take a top propagation, propagate that, and make it look good again, although that takes time. And that's basically a lost sale at that point. That kind of hurts your bottom line because you've got to wait now, and then you've got to put more effort into propagating it, etc. So if it's a worthwhile plant, you're going to do it. If it's not, hopefully you're going to avoid having to toss it or take multiple propagations and kind of spread those out. But the longer you wait, the longer you have to wait to recoup your costs. At that point, I think what I've seen is typically people will do purges, like the boutiques will do purges on Facebook or on Instagram, and they'll be getting rid of their ugly plants and let you do the work of propagating that thing. And typically, like, that stuff, if it's not dead, it's going to be either close to dead or ugly, or it's had bugs or something like that, and it needs to be worked on, so you're going to have to care for it. But you can get those at a really good discount typically, so it's not a bad ecosystem of moving plants through the community. The funny thing about those purges tends to be that they're done in quiet places. They're done on Facebook, so away from their public sales site. So you may go to their Etsy shop or you go to their Shopify shop, and in those cases, you're not going to see any of this stuff. It's going to be going in the back room somewhere, or they're having a clear out sale, and it'll be in a Facebook group that's private, and that way they keep the inventory that doesn't look great out of the public eye, and they still make a little bit of a profit, or maybe at least they make their money back selling off the bad stuff. And that's not really a bad way of doing things. It's just that if you're a public consumer of their product, you just don't see it very often unless you're really looking for it carefully. So the dead stuff tends to just kind of sneak out and never get looked at. Now, what gets me, I think, the most and bothers me the most is the social media aspect, and really more, I would say, like on the Instagram side of things. And personally, not being a TikToker, I don't really have an opinion on that, so I can't really say one way or the other whether it happens there as much as on Instagram. But on Instagram, you really end up with this culture of only showing the good stuff, and you never see the browning leaves. You never see the stuff that's kind of slowly dying off. I'm just looking here at a browning leaf while I'm talking. This guy here, this is Anthurium decipiens, and it came to me where like this leaf was already half browned off. I think it's eventually going to drop, but the mobile nutrients getting sucked back into the plant, and at the end of the day, it's actually got, I don't know if you can see that, new growth coming in right there. So, this is actually a plant that I chopped into 3. It had a little bit of root rot on here, but I've actually propagated it into 3 separate plants already. And all the other ones are looking pretty good, so I'm not too worried about it. It's a pretty hardy plant. But at the end of the day, like, you see that leaf, and it's ugly, right? And if I were to post that on Instagram, I'd get, like, no feedback on it at all. However, in truth, probably half of your leaves are going to look like that unless you are super meticulous about caring for your plants, or you just chop them off. And I think that's what happens with Instagram. You never see anything dead, or very rarely. And you never see anything that's on its way to dying. You don't see bad roots very often, all that kind of stuff. That's the reality of plant ownership. I think you should be okay with that. Why should you feel bad? It shouldn't make you feel bad to think about that kind of stuff. And I don't think it's a bad thing to show it either. Honestly, the funniest thing you'll see is go through the static photos of some of these plant influencers, even some of their reels too. You go through that stuff. Tell me how often you see the back of a specific plant that's shown multiple times over. I bet you'll see 3, 4, 5, 10 shots of the same plant over time where it's always facing the same direction. Is that kind of funny? Like, what's on the back? Is there a back? Does the plant just face one way? Reality is that the back probably doesn't look very good, and that's why you're not seeing it. So I've got my shroom socks on today just to remind me that myco and fungi can be both good and bad. And you're going to find decent overgrowth of stuff in your plants at some point. Now, hopefully it's the good stuff where it's helping your root system and not the bad stuff where it's kind of overtaking everything in your roots and killing it all. And, you know, if you've been collecting plants for any length of time, and I'm getting on to, I think, my 4th year soon of being a bit of a collector and doing my outdoor growing on the side. I'm sure you've seen a couple of my videos where I'm growing outside. Being a collector, you're going to have your share of dead stuff. It just happens. Things die on you totally unexpectedly sometimes, totally expectedly sometimes. It really depends on what your conditions are like. But you have to be okay with it. Now, I have what I've been calling my wheel of deadness. I don't know if you can see all the stickers on here. These are all labels of plants I've killed. And I keep them. Just to remember, hey, I can reuse this label if I ever get one of these plants again. I have done it. Second, it just reminds me of like, yeah, I had this plant at some point. What did I do to it? How did it die? And also just like, you know, do I ever want to buy this again, or am I just going to give up on it? There's lots in here. There's also a whole other one over here. Each one of these labels represents a dead plant. And I have not added to this in a bit. There's a bunch more that need to be added. So I'm going to collect some of those and throw them in here. And every time I kill a plant, I take a look at this and I think to myself, am I going to get this guy again or not? I also think to myself, you know, what did I learn from this specific plant? So I've got some stuff on here that would just kind of blow your mind because you probably don't want to know. You know, I've killed so many of these guys. Oh man, some of these are kind of embarrassing, to be honest. Some of this stuff is just pure neglect. It's quite funny to me to look at these now. At the beginning though, I mean, it did hurt. It hurts your feelings a little bit. You feel like you did something wrong, and it's very frustrating because a lot of these cost money. I mean, like I had some stuff in here that's pretty sad. Like this one specifically always gets me because I've had 2 of them and I've managed to kill both. This freaking Anthurium cuticoense, or however you pronounce it. I've had that plant twice. I don't even want to know how much money I spent on it because I got the first one in 2021 at the beginning of the year, kind of at the height of the plant boom. And it was before I realized I could do some of this importing myself. I remember how much I spent on it, which was definitely 3 figures, and that one died on me pretty badly. It melted effectively. I did get another one from Equigenera maybe a year later, and that guy melted on me too. And I'm like, I think this is just a hard to care for plant that I just can't deal with. And I've told myself now I'm not going to buy that plant again as much as I like it. I'll show you a picture of one up here so you can see what it looks like big. It's a beautiful plant. I do regret it. There's tons more plants in there. A lot of those, I actually have more of them. You know, it was one plant of several, or one died and I just threw the sticker on there so I could reuse it later. But I mean, that gives you an idea. You know, that's a lot of death. Which is, you know, you just come to terms with it. But if you think about it, in commercial agriculture, I think we have something like 80% annual plants. However, in nature, it's 90% perennial plants, which is a pretty funny balance when you think about it. So out in the wild, pretty much everything renews itself, comes back next year. Yet the stuff that you buy in boutique stores, etc., like, or even in your grocery store, almost all of it's stuff that's going to croak within a year. So you have to keep that in the back of your mind. This is like a normal cycle, and also what you're buying most of the time, you know, it's not expected to live forever. So if you've got plants that have lasted many years in your care, then you're doing pretty good. You know, just to talk briefly about the stuff that can kill your plants, there's a lot. And if you're a new plant parent, like, you probably don't know half this stuff. But I mean, for anybody who's had plants for more than a couple of years, you've probably had all of these things happen to you at some point. And, you know, it gets to a point where it's actually pretty funny. I mean, I've got this list in front of me. This is stuff I came up with. There's probably 25 other things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but I mean, overwatering probably the number one thing. Underwatering, that's definitely my number one thing. I don't overwater that often, but underwatering I do a lot. Like I've got most of my stuff in semi-hydro, so overwatering doesn't happen too commonly. It does happen from time to time where sometimes I've got more root in the water than I want. But most of the time, the problem is the underwatering where I forget to water something or it's behind something else and dries out. And then when you re-water it and you try to rehydrate afterwards, you get root rot. That happens. So root rot, clearly the next thing on the list. Stem rot, which is different from root rot. Sometimes you can get stem rot completely independently of root rot. You can have them both, or you can have one or the other, right? That happens pretty often. Stem rot is a bitch to get rid of. Like, you have to chop the plant. There's really no choice there. And at that point, you have to chop it and you get close to nodes. You have to check inside the stem, make sure you don't have rot inside of there. And if you do, you have to keep on chopping until there's no more brown left. And sometimes that means chopping all the way through the plant and there's nothing left. And you realize that the whole thing's rotted out inside. And from the outside, it looked fine. It was green. So it's a fake out, right? With root rot, at least you can see it. Like, it's pretty visible. As long as your plant is in a substrate where you can kind of take it out relatively easily, like any kind of semi-hydro or like tree fern or something like that, or in water, obviously, it comes out pretty easily. Now, if you're in soil, you're not going to see root rot so easily, and it's a little tougher to diagnose. So that happens. Too much light. This is also pretty common. Like, I mean, burning your plants till they cook typically just leads to kind of like drying out, which means underwatering because you've got no water. But I mean, you can cook the plants too, and you can just fry them. That happens pretty often too. If you get them too close to your grow lights or out in the sun, if you've taken a plant that's been indoors for a long time, and I did this very early in my plant collecting hobby where I took a plant outside. Not only did I get one plant that burned completely from being in the sun where it had been in like partial shade in the house for a while, I got another one that just loaded up with bugs from outside. And I think I carried Western flower thrips back into the rest of my collection and killed everything. So that was not a great experience. But I mean, this is all stuff that happens when you're not really experienced at what you're doing. So too much light for sure, not enough light, another problem that can clobber whatever you're working on. There's plants that just need a certain threshold of light, otherwise they're not going to grow, and eventually they're going to just die on you from being in the dark. And that happens, right? There's no photosynthesis happening or very little. It's not enough to sustain the plant. That happens too. Temperature and just like heat and cold, either putting your plant in different climates throughout your house or you're taking it indoors, outdoors, you can kill stuff very easily doing that. I see this much more with my veggie garden. You know, if you put out your seedlings too early, they can croak. At the end of the season, stuff freezes and kills half your crop, etc. So you have to be super careful about temperature with those things. Indoors with your plant collection, these things are all tropical. You have to keep a certain level of warmth going on or they're not going to be very happy. And if it starts getting cold, like, you know, my garage, I have to have the heater on in the wintertime. And if that happens, if I don't have the heater on for a day or two for whatever reason, like it croaks or, you know, the power is out or something like that, then I have a chance of like killing off a good chunk of my plants just from the cold. Like some of these guys, like a gloriosum, for instance, I'm pretty sure has to be in above 15 degrees Celsius at all times. And if it's not, it's going to start wilting on you and die. So, I mean, temperature both ways, even things like wind, too much breeze can snap your plant in half. Lots of bad stuff can happen there. Humidity is another big one. This happens with pretty much any kind of tropical plant where they expect a certain threshold of humidity. Like it's got to be above 50%. Ideally, you're kind of in that 60 to 70 range because that's kind of what they're used to. There's some plants they need like an 80, 90% humidity to thrive, right? And you can't provide that without being in an enclosed space, unless your house is literally just like a big, huge bathroom, and then maybe good luck with that. But if you're like me and you don't live in a sauna, then I don't use humidifiers in my house. I don't feel like having mold in my walls. And if I'm going to try and keep the humidity up, thankfully I'm in semi-hydro. So you get a natural level of humidity in semi-hydro from just having water sitting there at the bottom in your reservoir all the time. So if I put a whole bunch of plants into an enclosed space like my tent or a cabinet, and most of them are in LECA, I have a good threshold of humidity no matter what, and I don't have to do anything special like run a humidifier or anything like that. Not enough humidity, also a problem. Like I had a Warcreanum that if I kept it in anything below 60, 65% humidity, it would just crisp and die. And eventually it got root rot. It had everything wrong with it. That thing did last for a while, but like it only thrived when I had it in near 100% humidity. And since then I've told myself, I don't have the capacity / wherewithal / interest to maintain a Warcreanum in a really nice state. And I feel like if it's a plant that can only live in that type of environment, like an Anthurium splendidum or something like that, I don't really want it. I just want to live with stuff that's easy to care for. There's some trial and error in this, right? Like you buy a plant, you're like, okay, I bought it off Equigenera, for instance, and it dies on me. And I'm like, I know why it died. I can diagnose that. Do I want to buy it again? Probably not. For the most part, I'm just going to move on. So, I mean, along with temperature and humidity, dramatic changes in environment are another good one. Acclimation shock in general is something that's going to do some damage to your plants and obviously has a good chance of killing them. Like if you're transporting it from one location to another, you're shipping it, if it sits in like a UPS depot for the weekend, for instance, or if it's coming from Asia and it's like, Dragon Courier or something, and it sits for 3 weeks in LAX, your plant's going to die. I've shipped plants that have died. I've had plants shipped to me that have died. It happens both ways. You just have to be prepared for it. And I think like that type of transport shock or shock from acclimation once you've received the plant, those are common ways of killing plants. I think as long as you expect the unexpected when it comes to that sort of thing and just be aware that like there's a pretty good chance this is going to happen, so I better take precautions to avoid it, then you're in pretty good shape. It's all about being aware of what could potentially happen, right? So I think that's the problem like most newbies in the hobby face, is that they just don't know what's out there and what's going to do damage to your plants. And once you start realizing, okay, this is going to hurt, that's going to hurt, this is going to kill the plant, that plant's definitely going to die if I do this, you're like, okay, now I can prepare myself, decide ahead of time, do I really want to deal with that? And if I do want to deal with that, this is how I'm going to treat it. I'm going to put it in a box for a while. I'm going to isolate it so it doesn't get, pests on the rest of my plants. I'm going to make sure it has super high humidity until I can gradually lower it so it's at the same level as my tent. Patience is a virtue when it comes to plant collecting. I've learned that one. And I think that some folks are just in a big hurry to get Instagram photos of whatever new leaf popping out. And you don't realize that the plant hasn't acclimated to your environment yet, and you may get that one leaf and then it's going to die shortly afterwards. I've had that happen 100% this year to one of my plants that I showed you guys earlier, and this is my own stupidity. I think I showed you guys a video of this. I had a Crystallanum luxurians cross that I brought in, as well as a Magnificum luxurians cross that I don't know that I showed you guys, but I'll show you a picture of it here. That Crystal Lux got the worst root rot, and it was in pretty good conditions, and I literally had it sitting beside the Magnificum luxurians in exactly the same environment and climate, lighting, heat, etc. One died, one put out new roots. Go figure, right? I think it had stem rot. That's probably what got in there. It may have been there when it shipped to me and I just didn't know it. So these things happen. And I'm like, yeah, it's embarrassing. I managed to kill a plant that I actually put on video. But at the same time, the Magnificum luxurians looks great. So at least I got one of those too that looks good. I can hopefully at some point replace the other one. But to be honest, I think I prefer the Maglux anyways. So, what are you going to do about it? Now, hilariously, you can actually kill a plant with pots. I mean, this is possible both ways. You can under pot a plant to the point where it gets so root bound that it has no substrate left, dries out, and you get root rot, or the plant just dies from literally not having enough water because it's got nowhere to store it anymore because there's no substrate. You can have the opposite effect of over potting, where you end up with, this thing is floating in a huge pot and it's not able to do anything, and you end up with either, again, root rot or underwatering, overwatering. All these things happen in that type of environment too. I think it's probably maybe a little less visible in overly potted plants, but definitely with underpotting you can do this. And this kind of goes hand in hand with poor substrate choices. If you're somebody who is not familiar with semi-hydro, you can totally kill stuff by putting it in semi-hydro and not knowing what you're doing. Now, the opposite is also true, high plant, where if you are in soil, you can't see the roots very well. I mean, most of the time, unless you've got spectacular roots on there, using clear pots, which I do recommend if you don't mind the aesthetics of it. Or you can use a cache boat with your clear pot inside the cache boat. That's also good. So poor substrate choices in general, if you're using something that the plant is just not acclimatized to, or you can say, hey, I've moved a plant from one substrate to another and now it's doing poorly, those are things where you have some control over that. You can always flip it back if you start seeing it deteriorate. But it's on you to be mindful of that and to be cautious about it. Sounds like a lot of work, but if you're not repotting stuff all the time and not transferring from one substrate to another, you're probably going to be okay for the most part. But stick with what you're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with soil, use soil. If you love using perlite, use perlite. If you're in semi-hydro like Pon and LECA like I am, then I use those and I try and learn which plants do better in which substrate. And watching this type of video or all the other videos out there who talk about it gives you a bit of an idea of hey, if I'm buying that plant, I can kind of expect that this is what I should do and what I should use with it. So the other stuff that can really kill your plants, and this is stuff that people don't really know. I've done it to at least a couple of plants. Chemical treatments, the things that you do on the roots or even on the leaves that you are told this is going to work really well to clean your plant off, or you can use this and it's going to clean your roots and get all the algae off, etc. There's a number of these things that are out there, and if you don't know what you're doing or use the wrong concentration, you will destroy your plant. So things like using vinegar, various types of salts, even salt buildup on your LECA, for instance, can eventually do damage to the plant if you leave it on there, you don't flush your LECA. Just an example. Other stuff you can use, chlorine and bleach. I think people have used bleach for cleaning containers. The chlorine in there can do damage to your root systems, etc. if you haven't cleaned it properly. If you do any kind of flushing with that type of stuff, again, if you for some reason throw your LECA or your pond into bleach, it stays on there if you don't rinse it properly, and then it just does damage to the plant. It's invisible. You're not going to notice it's there. Something I've done, an example of this just kind of stupidity in general, is peroxide. Like hydrogen peroxide, using a tiny concentration of it can do some good and clean off things like algae in the reservoir of your container, for instance. However, if you were to just use pure hydrogen peroxide or use like a high concentration, dilute it first, you put too much into an existing ecosystem, you can just kill everything off. I've done this. I had this kind of curled bamboo that I've literally had for 20 years that was given to me by my cousin and his wife. I had this thing since like my first apartment, and it grew, was doing pretty good. I mean, it had been going for a long time. I'm not sure if it was bamboo or something like that. I'll show you a picture of what it looks like somewhere up here so you get an idea of what I'm talking about. It looked like bamboo and had little shoots growing off of it, and I had it in this really, really tall pot, and it had like a huge root system. And I thought to myself, it was full of algae. I'm just going to drop a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in here and, clean it out a bit. So maybe it'll kill the algae and I can like pour it out and replace the water. I did that, and I don't know what exactly happened. Maybe I put too much. It didn't feel like it, but just destroyed the entire root system for that plant. And it rotted, stem rot got in there and killed it off. I thought it might reroot, and I did have a segment of it start to push out roots a little bit later after I changed everything out. And then it succumbed to stem rot. This took forever. Like I didn't even notice at first because it was still holding together, because like the outer structure, the exoskeleton of the plant looked fine. And it started to kind of get a little bit darker color. And I'm like, what's going on here? It's not quite as bright green as it used to be. And I put my finger on it, squeeze it, and smush. It's just dead. So, stem rot is one of those hidden killers where you just don't see a whole lot going on from the outside. And these chemical treatments, like whatever you're doing, even stuff that's basic is like, not flushing your LECA, for instance, which you're supposed to do every once in a while. I mean, I could give you an example here of like unflushed LECA looks like this. This is purposefully unflushed because this plant is dead. But what I would normally do is dump this all out, put it into either boiling water or run it under a hose for a while and just clean it off outside. And eventually it's usable again. I'm not that picky about it, but that's exactly what it looks like. That's a salt buildup on top. I think there's probably a layer of dust on there too. Now, obviously, there's some basic stuff that can happen to your plants that it's completely out of your control for the most part, and just as random chance, like it's going to be an accident, for instance. I've had this happen. You can crash into something, knock it over, and just snap it in half. This happens. It's just life, right? There's not a whole lot you can do about it. That's kind of unavoidable. Your pet, you got a cat or something decides to eat your plant. My dog runs through and knocks something over, although he doesn't run a whole lot because he's almost 11 years old and quite portly. So he's not running anywhere, but maybe your dog runs and knocks stuff over. So, I mean, just that kind of stuff. My kids have destroyed at least one or two of my plants accidentally by just roughhousing near where plants are kept. Plants are going to die. It's unavoidable. So it's just more a matter of preparing yourself for it. Just being like, okay, I can deal with this. Let's move on. I mean, I think the number one way that you're going to kill your plants is probably through neglect and laziness. That's just the way of the world. Some of you guys out there, and I know a lot of those plant bloggers and YouTubers, are really meticulous about caring for their plants. I have, like I've mentioned before, job, 3 kids, wife, dog, mortgage, etc. And stuff piles up. You just don't have time to take care of it. It happens. So it's more a matter of like organizing yourself in a way where you're not going to run into these problems of like things are dying because you didn't get to them fast enough. And, being able to water stuff on a regular basis, like set a schedule, etc. Those are ways you can get around these things and just make them more manageable. And if you have too many plants, just get rid of some. Either toss them, give them away, purge them, whatever you need to do. But make a decision as to what needs to be in your life and what doesn't. I think I need to do that a bit more. I think everyone needs to do that a bit more. I guarantee you my wife will tell me that I need to do that more. So there's also a few more uncommon ways. I mean, some of these are common-esque, but like you'd call them uncommon because they don't happen to everybody. Ways that you can get your plants dead, and they're not going to happen to everybody, but they will happen to a certain number of people. The number one thing is going to be disease or pests, whether it's a virus or wilt of some sort or a bacterial infection. Some of these things are really hard hard to predict or even counteract. You need to be able to have like if you run a systemic through your plants, if you're like me and I'm using semi-hydro and I'm in Canada, it makes it really hard to get some of these systemics because they're banned in Canada and importing them is illegal. So you have to go and either fetch it yourself and drag it across the border with nobody looking, or you need to find somebody who already has some in your local area and try not to ship it anywhere. So, I mean, for instance, there's Azamax. That's a common thing that you can use. I think it's available in a lot of other countries that you can use in your semi-hydro and just kind of literally just put it into your semi-hydro nutrients and not worry about anything. And it's a systemic and it keeps your plants pretty safe. There's Bonide out there. I think it comes in granules and powder. Maybe you can get a spray as well, but like I can't get that easily. I can get it from some of the grow shops around here. They sell it kind of like under the counter and you can pick it up. I won't name any names, but I've picked it up that way. But that's typically a spray or it's meant for soil. It doesn't really work super well with semi-hydro and you can't really mix it with your nutrients because it doesn't dissolve into solution correctly and it's just not made for it. So not ideal. So like there's trade-offs with semi-hydro that come along that you're going to have to try and figure out, alternative paths to what might be much easier to do when you are working with soil or moss or whatever else, like some sort of solid substrate, tree fern, all those kinds of things. Again, it's uncommon, but I mean, disease happens. Like it's pretty hard to tell sometimes what is disease and what's not. Some of it's just looks like disease. Here's an example. This is an Anthurium Bessier X luxurians seedling that I just got. And you can see like one of the leaves is a bit crispy. And this one that came out, this is the most recent leaf, this bigger one, is also a little bit crispy on the edges, but this is from transit shock. This is not from anything special. And honestly, like it's pretty healthy, all things considered. This crispy bit, it's not going to get any worse. So to the untrained eye, you could look at this and be like, oh no, it's got a disease if you just saw it like this. But I, knowing where it came from, because I had this shipped in and it was cold and came with a heat pack, but it sat there for a day. And just knowing that this was already cared for reasonably well. I know the guy who had it sold it to me. It was an Etsy shop. I'll link his shop in the description below just in case you're interested because he had some nice seedlings. He told me that he had springtails and other kinds of beneficials going on. So like I know that he was taking good care of his stuff. So really what happened here is just combination of transit damage and probably the lack of humidity in the environment that I'm keeping it in while I isolate in the meantime before I add it to the rest of my collection. And that's something you have to learn to do too, is isolating things, keeping them separate. So if you bring something in from out of town or, over the border from another continent, people have bugs. And you can give me all of the takes on the phytosanitary certificates and all the stuff they have to do. Yes, they have to do all that stuff. Yes, stuff still makes it through no matter what. There's always going to be some pest that creeps through. So all they're doing is really kind of like cutting back the amount of total pests you're going to get, but you're still going to get some pests. Some of them are going to make it through that process. And as much as they try and like minimize it, that's really what the process is about. It's about minimizing. It's not about eradicating. So you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that you're going to end up importing stuff or buying stuff locally or shipping stuff in from across the country or across the border for me, like buying stuff from the US that probably either has had or currently has bugs, and you're going to have to deal with it. And by isolating, that's one way to identify when things are happening. It's also where you can spray stuff or keep it out of your main collection until you're sure that it's looking pretty stable. And at that point, then you're okay bringing it over. And I went from doing this for a few days, like I think originally I did it for a week, and now I do it for like a month. I keep things separate for a pretty long time. And it doesn't mean you don't have to enjoy that plant in the meantime. Just put it somewhere where it's not in close proximity to the rest of your collection, or like isolate it in a way physically, like put it in a container, put it in some sort of Rubbermaid or Tupperware kind of box. There's lots of different options for doing this. I keep mine inside of my closet back here where I've got my heat pump. And I know it's nice and isolated there. I also know that room is nice and warm. However, it's not very humid. So I tend to keep everything nicely watered in there. And I check it every couple of days. So I know that things are going to get a little crispy, just like this guy here is a little bit crispy. But I can deal with that. I'm okay with it. And I understand that like at the end of the day, it's going to come back into my collection and it'll be happy and it'll be acclimated to my environment and it'll feel pretty good. You just have to be aware of the fact that things will die. And you can probably prevent it in a good chunk of cases, but it's unavoidable for a number of things. There's another couple little uncommon ways that things can die. There's improper fertilization. I've done this to outdoor plants. I haven't really done it to my indoor tropicals, but I've definitely done it to plants outdoors, like pepper plants, for instance, where I have over-fertilized and not realized it, where I like literally doubled up on the fertilizer. I put in like a time-release fertilizer, and then I put in a liquid chemical fertilizer right afterwards, and they did not play nice together and burned like all of the leaves on the plant coming out. And it took a good month before the plant recovered, which put me behind the whole productivity cycle of a pepper plant by like a month, which is really bad when you're working in Vancouver where I am, and you only have like 4 months of weather that you can grow in, maybe 5 if you're lucky. That's funny. I was looking at my list here and I wrote down destroying an ecosystem with kindness. And I think this was similar to that plant story I was telling you about, the bamboo in the big container, where I introduced a chemical into that container that destroyed the existing like stable ecosystem in there. With repotting too, where you're like, okay, I'm going from soil to semi-hydro, for instance. And like your plant's roots are accustomed to not only the substrate, but to like all the bacteria and like the fungi, etc., that are going on in that substrate. And the minute you move it out into something brand new, it has to acclimate to like a whole completely different environment. And, you know, even if you introduce a new fertilizer or something like that, you can totally destroy the ecosystem if you don't know what you're doing. So lots of ways you can kill your plant through kindness. Overwatering is, again, a perfect example of killing by kindness, where you're like, I'm just going to keep on watering this thing. It looks like it needs water. Really? No, it doesn't. Just let it dry out. You're fine. Most of these plants will do fine as long as they don't go dry for like a week, you know, or 2 weeks. If it's dry for a couple of days, it'll still have enough reserves in its root system to not completely shrivel up and die. You can go for a week without that happening. I think the final one on my list of uncommon ways to kill a plant, and this is never your fault, this is really the fault of either the plant itself and like the genus you're dealing with, or it has to do with where it's coming from. So if it came from TC, for instance, tissue culture, if you're not familiar, or if it came from a grower who's producing their own seeds or hybridizing, and they give you bad quality seeds, for instance. This happens. You get, especially like when you're doing a pretty mass market, like large scale stuff, there's a good chance of bad genetics in the plant. And you have to be aware that that's a potential problem. So if you're buying something that's a seedling, you have a good chance of being able to identify genetic markers and traits of the plant that you like. If you're buying something as an actual germinated seed, for instance, or not even as a seed purely ungerminated that you need to germinate yourself, or if you're buying a plant from TC that's really, really tiny, super hard to tell if it's got bad genetics until you start growing it out. And there's a good chance if it just croaks on you, and I've had this happen with 2 Monstera mints, not just 1, 2, one of which, again, I showed you guys on the channel that it wasn't in very good shape. That was back in my tissue culture video where I showed you guys that Monstera mint that was in really bad shape. Yeah, that died. And not just that, the replacement also died. And then I just gave up because I'm like, I'm not going to try this plant again unless I buy one that's already grown past the seedling stage, because I had the worst luck with those. And I don't know if it was bad genetics or me just being shitty at dealing with plants coming from TC, which is also possible. But at that point, I just said to myself, this is not worth the effort anymore. It's not worth my time. It's not worth my money. And it's not worth the stress it's creating in my life. I don't want plants to cause me stress. I want them to cause me joy and happiness and relaxation. At the very best, I want to feel like I can be calm around them. And if a plant is causing me that kind of stress where I'm like, yeah, this is pissing me off, I'm not going to have it in here anymore. So as much as I want to have a whole nice collection of Monstera deliciosas growing up a pole somewhere in my house, I'm not going to have the mint unless I can find one for reasonable price that's already solidly grown. I've got an Albo that looks pretty good. I've got an Aurea that I need to chop up, and I have a variety of other Monsteras floating around. But like my dream of the huge cloud of Monstera mint and, you know, white monster, etc. going on, it might be a pipe dream based off of my conditions here. It also might be something I can do down the road when I find a better plant that I'm happier with that has better genetics. So I think for the uninitiated amongst you, like there's one other thing that can look like death that's not actually death, and that's dormancy. So plants can go dormant. Lots of different plants can go dormant. There's a lot of the perennial tuber-based plants, so like something like an alocasia or a colocasia, for instance. I think caladiums do it too. If it goes dormant, it looks dead. It looks like it's just turned back into a potato, and it's sitting there, and you're like, okay, is this thing going to grow again? There's lots of plants and flowers outside that grow from tubers, and you kind of expect that because you buy them that way. With alocasias or colocasias, you buy them a lot of the time, and it's a fully grown plant or it's a seedling, etc. And it's hard to tell that, you know, eventually if you keep it in your typical indoor climate, which can sometimes cool down in the wintertime in your house, that it might go dormant and drop all of its leaves and look like it's dead. So like my very first alocasia was an alocasia poly, which was, you know, the smaller Amazonicas. It dropped all of its leaves. I kept it in a window. I posted some Instagram photo, I'll see if I can find it, of that plant looking like amazing. I loved it. It was my favorite. It was my first ever alocasia. Since then, I've had dozens of alocasias, and then I've also produced lots of corms, etc. And now I consider myself a pretty good alocasia grower. As you can see from my golden bone over here, which is pretty monstrous at this point. I think this leaf here is definitely bigger than my head. Like this guy looks pretty damn good, and I haven't done dick all to keep this guy happy. I mean, you can tell. Look at the stem on this monster. Like, this needs a repot. It's actually got corms growing above ground, which is hilarious. This is a pretty big corm. It's like the size of a LECA rock, and it's growing there. I've actually got 2 pups. There's one that's kind of hard to see. It's down there. And there's a second pup growing down here. You can see this guy. This is a separate plant. This guy has gone down to the stump more than once. The first time around, I actually chopped the top. I did a head propagation on this guy unintentionally because I had thrips, and I literally cut him down to the stump, grew all this crap back again. Like, look at the size of this guy. So I think I've talked about this plant before too. That guy is one of my favorite alocasias. I really love him. If you can see him back here, I really love that guy. I love the yellow and green combination of that whole veining. It's such a cool, like, kind of neon color. Don't know if it really comes out on camera, but one of my favorites. I was inspired again by Kevin at Hakuna La Planta on that one. That guy, I've had him go down to just the stump. I've done it on purpose myself when I learned how alocasias worked, but he's gone down, I think, twice to the stump. The second time was due to environmental stuff. I had moved him from one climate to another in my house. I think he was in my Millsbow for a while, and I moved into my tent, and he dropped all of his leaves, just like mad plant, angry at me. And then I was pretty sure I knew what was going on. But with that first alocasia poly, I had no idea what was going on. Dropped all of its leaves, and I'm like, is this thing dead? And I did some research at that point. I think that's what you got to do, though, is like familiarize yourself with what plant you're dealing with. People buy a lot of plants. They don't know what to expect from it. I've had enough philodendrons, alocasias, anthuriums, syngoniums, everything come out the wazoo here, epipremnums. There's so many different aroids out there that have a lot of similar traits, but each one kind of behaves differently. And if you don't familiarize yourself with that species or the genus in general, then you're going to be surprised by a lot of things. And I think once you're familiar, that surprise goes away. There's more of an expectation of what to do, and you can feel more comfortable with it. And then you're like, okay, if it croaks, I know why it croaked, and I can explain it away. And at that point, I can decide whether I want to do it over again or not. So, dormancy is that last thing. And there's probably 20 other ways you can kill a plant. However, I'm not going to get into all of them here, but like that gives you a general idea of what's going on here. So, I mean, at the end of it, it may sound scary, but really everything, like literally everything out there is trying to kill your plant. But you know what? If you are protected by your shield of knowledge, then you can prevent most of that stuff. However, there's a lot that are just going to slip through the cracks. And I've got a couple here just as an example. I would call these my nemesis, I think, some of these guys. I've got a couple sitting on the table here, and I've got a couple more on a list here. And I already talked about the Monstera Mint, which is definitely one of my nemesis. I'm not going to ever look at that fucking thing again. But maybe I will. Somebody gives me one day, I will not say no, but I'm not going to go out and actively buy one of those bastards. So there's other plants, though. I've got other ones. I mean, I'm just looking through my list of plants that I have killed multiple times over. These are plants. I'll just give you a quick list. I'll show you a picture of each one, what it should look like. I think this is probably the worst one. This is the stump of a melanochrysum. Philodendron melanochrysum is a beautiful plant. As I mentioned earlier, it can get really, really big. I've never been able to size one up, although I haven't really tried super hard. I managed to kill that one with very little effort. My gigas, however, has taken over my entire Millsbow cabinet. I'm sure I could propagate the hell out of that thing if I wanted to. Just haven't bothered, but it's growing all over the place. Now, out of these plant nemesis, the alocasia, I think I showed you guys this in another video. This had leaves the last time I showed you this plant. This is the Alocasia infernalis, which is now a stump, and I'm hoping is going to grow back. I'm hoping against hope. I don't know if this is mush or not. It feels like it's got some actual like heft to it there. This is just a corm now. So I'm going to let it grow back. I can keep it on a heat mat, keep it warm. Hopefully it'll come back. I've killed 2 other Alocasia infernalises. One of them I bought during like peak 2021 plant prices. And that was expensive and it melted. And it's one of those things where you get these plants that just melt. And you're like, I cannot understand what I did to it exactly. Probably too much humidity. That was what killed that one. The second one, I am pretty sure I underwatered it, and that one died because of root rot due to underwatering. Like the root rot due to underwatering is like a common occurrence where like you miss a watering or two, you come to it, you water it, and then the roots have dried out so much that they can't accept the water anymore, and then they end up rotting in that moisture, right? So I'm pretty sure that's what happened to my second infernalis. This guy, I've kept it pretty much enclosed in that container the whole time, so I'm hoping that it will come back, and it was just, it dropped its leaves, it was unhappy for a bit, and now it's nice and warm, and it's going to grow back again. So again, it's one of those plants where if I ever get a variegated version of that one, I would really love that. I don't even know if there is an infernalis variegated version. I have to look around. I'm looking through my list again. Oh, this one pisses me off every time. The pinguicula, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, pinguicula The butterwort, it's a carnivorous plant. It's very small, and they grow pretty well if you water them regularly. You can put them on top of something like pond or in moss, and you just have to keep the moisture there because basically they dry out instantaneously and die if you miss one watering. They are such frustrating plants. Their root systems are tiny little hairs, super small, almost looks like sphagnum moss. And if you don't water them, they dry out like that. They're dead. And I tried to have those guys in one of my cabinets because I didn't want to have like, the yellow sticky tape. And I was hoping that they would attract some, fungus gnats or whatever's creeping around in there. And I think I went through 4 or 5 of those. And I think at one point I had 3 of them at the same time, and they all died within a week of each other. Again, that's a plant now I've decided I'm never going to have that in my collection. Didn't do a whole lot for me while it was alive. And it caused me a lot of grief because it kept dying on me anytime I didn't look at it straight. So I am going to make sure I never touch that one again. I got like 3 Anthuriums in this list that I've had problems with throughout the years. One of them is actually here. Yeah, this is what's left of an Anthurium regale. I've had a couple of these guys where I don't know what happened exactly, but I rotted them out. This guy I've had sitting in perlite for I don't know how long. Is this rotten? This is just rotten. It's just a hollow piece of stump. I don't even know why I've got this in here. I need to throw this out. This was one of the Equigenera specials. Came as like a huge chunk, and it just all had root rot pretty much immediately, and then stem rot, and then I chopped it up and thought I had salvaged 2 or 3 chunks of stem and thought they were looking fine. They all went in there. I put them in perlite, kept them warm. I had a little bit of water in there. Humidity level was good. Everything looked pretty perfect. Nothing. And just literally, it's like a hollow piece of wood now. You just smush it with your fingers. Yeah, that one was a pisser. I'm never buying another regale. It's, again, one of those things where I've just had, even when I had the regale in my room, it was crisping. Kind of like this guy, but consistently, like the leaf would just crisp all the way up. And it just didn't like being in any kind of room humidity, like around 50%. Needed to be in something higher. And it's just so much work. I don't have the energy to take care of a plant like that, particularly when a regale gets so big. They can get really massive. So you get this massive plant that just you have to take care of and watch like a hawk constantly. It's not worth the effort. There's one plant, another Anthurium again, that I have had a couple of and I'm not going to get again. That is the Anthurium villanorum. That guy looks pretty good, green, but he's got this kind of chonky stem to him again, but he seemed to get root rot very easily, even kept in warm climates. I've had 2 of them that I've had root rot on both. They did pretty good for a while, and then they just went kaput. Could never get it big, and it was just a really frustrating plant. I think you can get them for under 40 or 50 bucks on Equigenera now, maybe even less than that, maybe half of that. I'm not sure what they're going for. One of those plants where I just can't keep it alive, and it doesn't like my environment, doesn't like what I tried to do with it, so I'm not going to bother anymore. The root rot problem with that plant was consistent, and I'm not going to make the effort again. But again, that was one of those ones where I got the first one in the middle of the plant craze of 2021, and you can go look at the trend prices for that plant back then. It wasn't that great either. So it's kind of nice to see that it's come down quite a bit now, but I would never buy that plant again just due to the experiences I've had with it. Sorry, if it sounds like I'm losing my voice a bit, it's probably because I am, because I think I've got a bit of a sore throat going on. So a little gravelly today. Last one that really bugs me is the Anthurium metallicum. You guys know this plant, and Kevin, again, at Hakuno Plant, I keep pointing out to him because he has these huge plants. He has a massive metallicum that looks fantastic, and I'm, again, super envious of that plant. I have had a number of metallicum seedlings come through. I got all of them through Equigenera, if I remember correctly. I think I'm down to 1 left now. That's in an enclosure in my grow tent, and it's in a humidity sealed container. Still seems to be alive, but I've had, I want to say 5 at this point, and I think I bought 1.3 at the same time because they were pretty cheap. The first time I bought it, though, it wasn't cheap, and that guy, he looked really good for a long time, and then he went kaput as well. And again, root rot got that guy, I think it was. Root rot is pretty much the number 1 Anthurium killer in my books, besides bacterial stuff, which you see every once in a while. But the root rot got that guy, and I just really wanted to get a nice big metallicum. That's kind of one of those plants where I'm if you can hybridize it, I would love to do that too, but it looks so good just by itself. It's such a nice plant. I think that one I will continue to try and keep it alive. At least the last one I've got, I hope is still alive. I haven't checked it for a couple of weeks, so I should probably take a look and see where it's at. But yeah, that's a frustrating plant, I gotta say. I'm sure lots of people have good luck with it, but in northern climes like I'm in here, not as easy to keep it alive. So yeah, like out of the plants, like my nemesis plants, that's probably the big ones. I have, calatheas, for instance. Like I've had calatheas and I gave up on those really early. Like they look nice. Same with marantas, etc. Like they look nice, but they're not worth the effort. It's like having a cat. I don't really want this thing that just hates me all the time. I'm just going to avoid it. And, like there's tons of plants. You're going to develop your own nemesis plants, and your nemesis will piss you off until you realize that either you're going to keep going on that specific plant until you get the perfect one that suits your lifestyle and environment, or you're just going to cut it and that's it. Move on. Just why is it worth the effort? What I wanted to kind of go through here, some solutions for you. So hopefully you can like make an effort to do something better. Maybe you can improve your conditions for your plants so they're a little happier. But generally speaking, like, so you're more prepared for what to deal with, or at least some suggestions on like how to improve the situation. So for this, talking about dead plants and dying plants, some of them, I think the basic stuff is just like pruning. If your plant has got dead leaves, you got diseased leaves going on, like take them off. If they're being drained out, it's like the yellowing bottom leaf of an Anthurium, for instance. A lot of the times you can wait for the plant to pull the mobile nutrients back out of that leaf, and it'll kind of dry out and crunkle up and fall off on its own. And I try and do that wherever possible. But if you see a leaf that's clearly like diseased or bugs have been at it, etc., and you can't save it, don't hesitate to prune it off. I can't think that leads into if you've got problems like watering where you've overwatered or underwatered and you're getting stem or root rot, it's time to propagate, right? So take that top cut. Let me give you an example here. This is an Anthurium pedito radiatum, which I just got pretty recently. He's got some nice, fresh, new water roots going on here that I'm going to try and keep in the water. He's also got some roots that look pretty good at the bottom here, but like, I may end up, if there's stem rot at the bottom, I'll have to chop the bottom bit off. I'm just going to check this actually. Does it feel kind of soft? No. He's pretty happy down here. But I did actually prune off a lot of the dead roots when I got this guy because he had a bunch of squishy roots. I took those and I pruned them off, and I left the rest of the roots that were still good, and everything still seems pretty happy in here. And he is, like I said, putting out nice new white water roots. So I'm going to transfer this guy pretty soon. But like if I had further root rot or stem rot below here, I could just snip right around here or around here, wherever I felt the stem was starting to go. You take a look inside and you make sure it's not brown in the center of the stem, and you keep on going until it's white, or at least like the color of the rest of the stem. And I think that's like the safest bet there. But like a top cut will save you a lot of hassle if you can do it. And you can just take your plant, propagate it, and move on. And then you're pretty safe from like anything else happening. And then you can just get rid of the bad stuff. When you're propagating though, like there's some things you want to prevent. Like you want to prevent the plant from dying after propagation. I got another example of this guy here, which I think I showed you guys in my previous video where I was doing top cuts. This is my Anthurium Pappy Blue. You see this leaf here? It's kind of yellowing a bit. What's happened here is this was underwatered. So I actually forgot to water this guy and he kind of drought out a bit. But the plant is fine, and this is the newest leaf, which was the one that was just peeking out, I think, on the top of the plant when I showed you guys last time. So this has been about 4 or 5 weeks since that video, and I mean, this leaf looks fantastic. And so this is the newest leaf, so I know this plant is doing fine. It's starting to caterpillar a little bit. I think the growth point might have dried out a teensy bit, so I'm not sure if it's going to pop a new growth point a little bit lower down. But in my tree fern mix, look at these roots. So that's all root. So this guy is pretty ready to be transferred into a different substrate. And I mean, that leaf is beautiful. Look at that. It's got a bit of a bolete texture to it, but like it's this kind of blue-green color. And I mean, it is rooted like a beast in there, so it looks pretty damn good. Very happy with that. But this was a top cut that I took off a plant. The bottom cut was questionable, and it did break due to an accident, right? So those are things that you can do. This leaf, by the way, I don't know if you guys saw my last video where I talked about the SP Morona, but this is one of these plants where I took off a leaf or two because of thrips, and it just graded more for me, and it gave me this. Now look at the length of this. It's at least 2.5, 3 feet long, this leaf. So like that's me, and there's the leaf, and it's going down to my pants here. So this is pretty long. That is a nice leaf. And this is a plant where I took off 2 leaves due to thrips in the tent. And it came back and gave me this guy. And even the last leaf before that, shorter, but I mean, really, really nice, and no damage or anything like that too. It looks great. But I mean, look at the size of this thing. This is massive. So very happy with this. But again, this is one of those plants where I pruned it. and came back like, you know, gangbusters, right? So don't be afraid to take a top cut or prune a plant if it's not looking its best, and just kind of move on from there. Just get rid of whatever's dead and just move on and save what you can. I think it's all about like preserving the plant bits that are still kicking. When you're taking propagations, also you want to do things like try and let your cut callus over. You can prevent further problems like further root rot or bacterial infection, stuff like that, by just taking good care of the cuts. So, you know, using something like sulfur dust on your cuts and just let it get in there. This is a fungicide and miticide. It's a good thing to kind of keep safe around there. You can also enhance the chances of your plants living and rooting better by using something like a great white, which is a mycorrhizal inoculant, which is, you know, again, good fungus versus bad fungus. That guy will help you out a little bit. You may not want to combine those two because one is a fungicide. Kind of pick which one you want to use there. On the actual cut, you can use the fungicide. But then, you know, once the roots are starting to go, then use the great white, because with no roots, there's really no point using mycorrhizal inoculant. So just kind of make sure that you're using good stuff to keep your cuts happy. Like you can use charcoal on there as well. There's lots of different things you can do to prevent things from getting worse after you've taken a cut. If you're not into using the myco, you can also use like rooting hormone. If you're in semi-hydro, you can actually combine both and put rooting hormone in your nutrient solution and then use the myco as well in there. So you can combine some of these things. Now, if watering is your problem, and like it's kind of my problem, so I can totally commiserate with you, water on a schedule. Go into semi-hydro. Semi-hydro saves me so much time. I have a lot of plants, but the fact that most of them are in semi-hydro means that I can just water one time. I fill up my huge canister of water. I think it's called Rainmaker, I think it is. I'll show you guys a picture of it. I fill up my huge canister of nutrient solution. I mix it all in there. There's like 12 liters in that thing. And I go and I can pretty much do most of my tent with one load. So that's a pretty good time saver. There is time involved in mixing the nutrients, but I do that once, and I do that once a month, and that's it. And in between, I might sneak in and like the plants that are in moss, like this guy here, this stock block F2, I will then water these guys by hand a little bit just so they don't dry out too much. You know, same thing with the little guys, like my Bessier X Lux here. I will hand water this. This guy actually needs a bit of a water now. I can feel it's getting a little dry. But that guy's isolating right now. I'm doing a bad thing by keeping it with my other stuff for this video, but I'm going to put it back in isolation afterwards. And I just keep an eye on it and let it dry out. I mean, here, this is an example of dried out moss. It's hard as a rock. It's crispy. It's kind of like touching bark. So those things you need to hand water. But like if you get a chance to move them out of this substrate that they're in into something that's going to last longer, like semi-hydro, do it. It'll save you a lot of time and your watering worries will diminish. Trust me. The other thing you can do is if you're not into it, this works with both semi-hydro and non-semi-hydro, is to get pots that have a water meter on them. I'll show you guys an example of this, but the pots with water meters are really nice and they, you know, for the most part are pretty accurate. You can get the ones that have the water meters that stick out on top, or you can get the ones that have a water meter at the bottom, and it'll tell you, like if it's low on water, you'll be able to see that it's empty. So if you're bad at watering like I am, that's one of those things where I try and get pots with water meters. Saves me a lot of time, saves me a lot of grief. I think probably the number one problem that you'll see, particularly with new collectors, is ventilation. And that is something where it's really not obvious unless somebody's told you about it. If you're in a Mills bow, for instance, you can use something like this. This is a little 4-inch fan that you can hook up. It's a USB fan. You plug it into your power bar or something, and you run 2 of these inside of your Mills bow all the time, or even run it on a schedule. And that will keep things moving. Airflow is so critical, particularly to like velvet anthuriums and plants that are kind of sensitive like that on the leaves texture, etc. Airflow will help you with humidity problems, with too much moisture on the leaves. It'll help you with your plants getting a little stronger because they're getting buffeted by the wind a little bit. So they have the ability to like build up a teensy bit of strength and be able to be resilient against that wind. And it'll help you with bugs because you won't have as much of a problem with bugs creeping around and not getting blown off your leaves. If you use something like beneficials, however, you got to be careful with the fans. Like I tend to turn off my fans when I'm using beneficials. So like I'll go for like 10 days with no fans because I've had, you know, Orias insidiosus or something, the minute pirate beetles they're called. I have those in my tent and I've spent whatever it costs to get those in there. I let them loose. I turn the fans off for 9-10 days. At the end of that period, I know for the most part they're like dead and done and they've done their business. And then I can turn the fans back on again and I run them on a schedule. Now in my grow tent, I have fans on the ceiling that kind of point down on different angles inside of the tent and they oscillate. And those are bigger fans, like monkey fans. They run, I think the ones I have are Secret Jardin, I don't know why it's like Secret Jardin, I guess. Monkey fans. They clamp onto the poles inside of the tent and they oscillate. and they're like, I think they're a 6-inch fan. And I run those programmatically through like a Google Home automation. So I've got a bunch of automations that I run that do different things. And this one runs the fans for like 5 minutes per hour. That way I don't have the fan running full blast all the time, and the plants still get a little bit of wind here and there. And I alternate them because they're in different directions. And that way life is like, it just feels a bit more natural. You get a breeze coming through for a while and then it stops. And then you get some calm and then you get a breeze coming through for a while and it stops. And it's not like too hard on the plants. It's not too hard on your power bill, and it's not too hard to set up. It takes a little bit of fiddling to get it going. But once you're there, it's pretty easy to deal with. I think at some point I'm probably going to do a video talking about some of like the home automations that I do to help with my plants, and like how I've got my tent set up and like automating the lights and everything that's going on, the ventilation system. I've got like the HVAC type of setup in there with a duct fan blowing everything out. I'll do a video on that for you guys so you guys can see how I've got my environment set up, because that works pretty well for me. But I mean, even with that setup, you still have problems. Plants still croak because you're just not paying attention, or because they get bugs or whatever else. Something that people will use in environments with low humidity is a humidifier. Now, personally, I mentioned this earlier, I don't like using humidifiers. If you're in a house like me, or if you own your own place like an apartment or whatever else, humidifiers, especially if you run them a lot, can do some damage to your house. You can get mold inside of your walls. It's bad for your breathing. You can get like pulmonary stuff from it if you're doing it in a room where you actually sleep, for instance. I don't recommend it. My wife is a nurse and she does not like that at all. So we don't do that here. I could use a humidifier inside of my grow tent, but like I mentioned earlier, I have everything in semi-hydro. I don't need it. There's enough humidity in that tent. Like, it runs at like 80% humidity in a 4x4 by 8 foot high grow tent. And it has close to 80% humidity at night when the lights are off. When the lights are on, it runs at 75% humidity. So like, the lights are warm, they're LEDs, but they still provide some heat in there. And when the humidity gets a little lower when you're running the fans as well, but like, it's always above about 65% in that tent. And that's purely due to my semi-hydro having, a decent amount of fluid in there. And it's like a lot of water, and it creates just natural humidity. So you end up with like a pretty good microclimate that you don't have to do a whole lot to maintain. So a humidifier is not really necessary. Now, if you're in soil or you're in an environment where it's pretty dry and arid, then you might need to use a humidifier inside of your tent. But if you can get away without it, I would suggest you should, because it's an extra cost, extra effort. You have to fill it up. And it has a lot of like inherent problems if you're running it in like an open space in your house. So I wouldn't recommend it. I know a lot of people use them, but like, for me, it's a no-no. Something you can do to improve your chances when you're bringing plants in is to better acclimate them. Like I mentioned earlier, just keeping stuff inside of boxes. You can use a big Rubbermaid, Tupperware, whatever, big box, plastic boxes, containers to keep stuff isolated, and also to keep the humidity high in those containers. So for a plant that you've imported, let's say you got something from Equigenera or from tropicals, you bring it in and it's used to a much higher humidity and a much more warm tropical climate, you pop it in a box and start to acclimate it to your environment that way. And just every once in a while, slowly open the door. Like, leave it open for an hour a day. Leave it open for 2 hours a day. Leave it open for 4 hours a day. And eventually, leave it open all day. If you're going to put it into a tent, then you can pretty much, once you've done your isolation, you feel like it's clean and it's not going to cause you any trouble due to bugs or anything, take it from there and transfer it into your tent where the humidities are pretty close to the same thing. If you're going to put it in your main room and you're going to keep it in a lower humidity environment, then do that acclimation process of like slowly letting it get used to it. It may not be happy at the end of the day. If it's a plant that requires like a 60% or plus humidity, your house may not be good enough to do that. Unfortunately for you, it just may not be the right environment. But you can either be persistent about it, and I've seen people acclimate plants that everyone says needs super high humidity to like 45% room humidity, and it's still good. So it's possible, but it takes a long time. And I think that people tend to rush and expect it to happen in like a month or two. And really, it's like a 3, 6, 12-month process for your plant to actually acclimate properly to your environment. So patience, it's all patience, right? You need to be patient and willing to kind of accommodate the plant. Don't try and force the plant to accommodate you. So when talking about using like a closed container, what I mean is something like this. This is a small one. For instance, you can see the humidity in here. This is like probably close to 100% humidity inside of this thing. And this inside here is my Syngonium rayi, one of them, which I was trying to rehab because I had literally cut this thing down to a stump. And Syngoniums are notoriously hardy plants, and this guy from a stump has grown this huge vine inside of this tiny container. Like, this is a pretty small box. I think this is like a 6 by 4 by maybe 5 box. It's pretty small either way. And while we're in here, there's a dead leaf back there. Pluck that guy off. I think I did underwater it at one point, and it kind of dried out a couple of leaves. There you go, dead leaf material. This is not a bad thing. It's just natural, and this really feels really good to toss it in the bin. You guys remember these bins? If you don't remember the bin, I'll do a throwback link for you. It feels really good to prune stuff sometimes, right? And it's like, hey, now the plant looks better. It's healthier. It's got less potential for rot in there. I'm going to put him back inside here because he's growing all over the place. But like, I have a whole pile of rayi. Rayi is, it's like a slightly more uncommon version of the Syngonium wendlandii. I have a couple of those floating around too, but I also have like a Syngonium wendlandii scrambled eggs, which has variegation that looks like scrambled eggs, which is pretty cool. I think I've mentioned that one to you guys before as well. Now, as an example, that's an example. You can get bigger boxes, bigger plants, bigger boxes. They're not very expensive, these boxes. You get them super cheap at like the dollar store. They're great for this kind of thing, and you can just stand them up on its side like that if you really want to. You can even plop it on a heat mat and keep things warm in there, keeps the humidity going on. It's like a little ecosystem for the plant, right? Now, on that note, like, I'm sitting here in a pretty non-humid environment. I just took this out of my cabinet. So this is like my relative humidity right now is 35% according to this. This is a humidistat. It shows the temperature up here as well as like the high and low temps. And it shows the humidity as well, like the high and low humidities of wherever it's been since it was last reset. And in my case here, it's sitting at around, I don't think it's 25 degrees because I think I just took this out of the tent and it's kind of like the lights, maybe stuff are warming it up. And same thing with 36%. It's probably, I think it's about 40, 41% humidity in this room. It's kind of creeping around there. But this guy is also Bluetooth. They have an app for it, the GoV app, which I use to monitor these guys. So I've got 4 or 5 of these in the house, and I can see them all from sitting in the house, which is pretty cool. I don't know if they make Wi-Fi versions of it. This is Bluetooth as far as I remember. But it's really handy and it's cheap. I think it was like $20. You can get 2 of them for like 35 or something. Canadian, not American. And they're really good. Like, I've used these for several years now and I'm really happy with them. I think the only thing you get some burnout on the screens every once in a while, but like, they're really good. That humidistat gives you the relative humidity. You know what's going on. It makes you feel comfortable with what's happening in your house, with your environment. You know exactly what the differences are between like the high and the low. If you move things around, you can tell like, oh, it's dropped 15% humidity moving from here to there. It takes you 2 seconds to carry this thing around and let it like reset wherever it's sitting, right? Super easy to use. I mean, the same deal with like heat mats. I've got a heat mat, but I'm not going to pull it out because all these plants are sitting on top of it. But here's a box for a heat mat. This is just an example. You can buy them. They come rolled up like this. This is a standard seedling tray heat mat, like 10 by 20. 1020 is what they call them, the seedling trays. This is a standard heat mat that goes under a 1020 tray. You can get bigger ones that are like double wide as well. So you get like they're 20 by 20, for instance. I think you can get like 48 by 20 as well, which is like huge and covers like a whole table. Those are really good and they're not very expensive either. You can buy cheap heat mats, again, like $20 thereabouts. Get a bunch of those. Just be wary that heat mats, if left unattended, are a bit of a fire hazard, and you know, you could get yourself in trouble if you run them all the time like I do. But at the same time, for things where like if I've got plants in water, I'm sitting these guys on top of a heat mat, and that way the water stays like just above room temperature, like 20, 22 degrees, and it doesn't get too chilly on the root systems, and they're pretty happy that way. Now, if you put something that's in moss, for instance, like this Bessier X Lux on a heat mat, this is really small. This is going to dry out in a hurry. So you got to keep an eye on it and make sure that it stays watered and hydrated in general, because moss on heat mats, that combination, unless it's in an enclosed container, it sucks it out pretty much instantaneously. So you're going to have to watch it like a hawk. Again, heat mats are great in colder climates for me. Like, it's almost necessary. Like at the bottom of my tent, I use a couple of heat mats for all the stuff I've got that's either in prop boxes or that's kind of sitting there for transitioning imports, whatever that I've got sitting in there. So they get the light from the big lights in the tent, but they're inside of a box sitting on a heat mat, so the water or whatever else is in there stays at like room temperature-esque. Now, in terms of bugs and things like that, I mean, I've done another rant about bugs that you can go and look at in one of my previous videos. I will link it up here so you can go and take a look at that, where I talk a bit more in depth about bugs. But beneficial insects are great for this, and you can get a bunch of different kinds of them. They're probably on the pricier side as far as like dealing with your pest infestations goes, but they're pretty effective. I've had really good luck with the minute pirate beetles. I used the predatory mites as well, and those work reasonably well. And so you kind of combine that, and like every once in a while I'll spray a couple of plants. Like when the rotation drops and you've got like there's a gap between your beneficials and the next round of beneficials, I'll take out plants that look like they may have the threat of a problem or a problem, and I'll spray them down with something like Safer's End All, and I'll pop them back in there, and then I'll give it a week before I introduce new beneficials at that point. So It's a bit of maintenance, but I find like the beneficials, I run them every like kind of 6 to 8 weeks. And there's that week or two gap in between where nothing's really that effective. Sometimes you need to spray a little bit during that period, but like that's how things keep from devolving into too bad of a cycle of neglect or bad bugs eating your stuff. And for dealing with other types of bug infestations, there's all sorts of sprays. There's mosquito dunks. There's the yellow and blue sticky traps that you can get for like thrips or for fungus gnats. Those all are things that exist that you can use. So just familiarize yourself with the different traps you can use, etc. And it'll just kind of solve a lot of your problems. I think bottom watering for me like got rid of fungus gnats with pretty much 100% efficacy. And then moving to semi-hydro, once I moved out of soil into semi-hydro, that made my life a lot easier, and fungus gnats were way less of a problem. But I mean, that's something that a lot of people struggle with, for instance. There's also lots of different meters that you can get, like depending on what your problem is. This is like a water level meter as well as a pH meter. These things are dirt cheap. You can get them for like, I don't know, $10, $12 on Amazon. Tells you moisture levels. I think it tells you your pH. I'm pretty sure it does. Is this one just a moisture meter? It says it's a 3-way, but I know you can get both. This one, however, this is a pure pH meter. So what it looks like, you use that for your semi-hydro nutrients. You can take a look and see whether you're too acidic or too basic, and you can adjust and try and get into that happy zone of like whatever plant you're dealing with, whether it's like in the 5.5 to 6 range or 5.5 to 6.5 or 6 to 7, depending on the plant. And finally, these are a little bit more technical, and I don't know that you necessarily need them, but this is a TDS EC meter. So TDS is total dissolved solids, I believe, and EC is electrical conductivity. So you can get one of these guys. You're getting pretty technical at that point. I don't use this very often, and I don't really feel that I know how to use it well enough. The pH meter I can get by with, but like this is probably above my pay grade. I bought it because it came with the pH meter. It was free, so I thought, what the hell? I haven't really used it much, but it does exist, so it's out there. If you know what you're doing, this is probably super valuable for you. If you're me, I'll probably have to live without it. That'll help you with your nutrients and kind of monitoring kind of abnormalities in there. Familiarize yourself with the tool before you buy one. Like, understand how it works and whether you actually need it or not. I mean, these moisture meters, again, are super dirt cheap. You can just get by with one of these pretty easily. I would suggest that if you do want to use semi-hydro, that the pH meter comes in pretty handy. As far as light goes, because again, too much light, too little light, you can get these guys. This is a digital lux meter, and I'm not going to run it right now because I don't even know if it's got a charge. Beep, beep. All right, so I can kind of aim this at a light, and it'll give me a reading. I don't know how all this is going to work. It's aimed at my ring light right now, and it's giving you a reading. It tells you like the lux level of the light you're at. I think you can switch the modes from like lux to foot candles and get a good sense of the light intensity. Lux is kind of creeping up and down there, pretty high, pretty low. Again, technical, but I mean, if you're having issues with light, then getting one of these for pretty cheap. Again, these, I think this runs around $25. It's even got like the swivel head on it, which is pretty cool. And I'm not shilling this product, I just have it, so I thought I'd show you. But this, it comes in a little case, it explains how it works, etc. Doesn't hurt to have one. If you're doing anything with like a grow tent, for instance, you've got the big lights in that you spent like $500 on. I've got like a 480 watt like Spider Farmer grow light in there. This is handy for measuring things. And then you can tell, like I know, for instance, certain anthuriums like really high light levels, certain anthuriums like lower light levels, and some of them, if you're really into having dark anthuriums, which is super popular with a lot of people on Instagram and everywhere else, as well as collectors, having the dark anthuriums, you kind of want to keep your light levels a little lower for a lot of them, which means like moving your plants lower down in your tent. Using this, you can kind of measure the light level necessary. I think Jay Vanini has a great post somewhere on his site that talks about the light levels for a lot of the velvet anthuriums. I'm going to link that in the description below. You can go and read that. Jay Vanini is like a collector hybridizer. In a different video, we'll talk a little bit about his plants, but I'm no expert on Jay Vanini specifically, but I know a couple of folks who are very familiar. And he's got a couple of articles about anthuriums and about aroids in general that are worth a read. They're very long. It's more like a novel than an article, but like I will definitely link those in the description below. Go check that out. If you have an hour or two to kill, if you're in soil, again, the pH meter, use this for checking your pH levels when you're watering as well. You can use it with semi-hydro, you can use it with soil. It just depends on checking it beforehand, right? So this way you don't over fertilize or create too much of an acidic situation for your plants. These are all things that can help, and it's not that hard to maintain. So if you've got a lot of plants, I would suggest having a couple of these tools around helps. Finally, last couple of tips, like things that you may not think of off the top of your head, but like that are pretty helpful. Like besides just obviously propagating the plant if you think it needs it. If it's about to die, and you can take a top cut, take a top cut. The other thing you can do is also try and give it away. I think there's plenty of Facebook groups out there. There's people who don't have a ton of cash to spend on plants. I know that the Vancouver Houseplants group does something like a Free Friday where there's a whole thread of free plants. This is not a bad way to get rid of your stuff, and a lot of people are totally happy with taking your half-dead plant and trying to revive it. It's a little bit of a project, right? It's something that you spent time on, you gave up on, but it may be on its way out. Maybe you take the top cut unrooted, give it away, see if somebody wants it. I think there's just a lot of things you can do that prevent tossing it in the bin, unless it's completely toast. In that case, go for it. The most I've learned about plants has been from killing them. As morbid as that sounds, like every time a plant dies, I typically take a look at it and be like, what happened here? And I think about what I could have done differently the next time. Sometimes it's obvious, like clearly underwatering or whatever else. Sometimes it's not so obvious and I have to think about it a little bit. And it prevents me from making the same mistake in the future a lot of the time. And if something happens where it's like, okay, multiple plants croak at once, and that happens, I've got a bunch of dead plants in front of me here. In those cases, sometimes it's completely unavoidable and you can't do much about it, but at least take a little bit of knowledge out of it and see if you can help yourself in the future. I think that's just the way to go there. Before we completely wrap this up, I got a few dead plants here that look very sad because there's pretty much nothing left of most of these. This is a good example of plants I either will not buy again, had bad genetics and I bought them from a crappy seller, which I will not buy from again, taught me not to buy from that seller. This one plant seller, I bought, I think 5 plants. I think 4 of them are dead and one of them is not good quality. Bad genetics. This Monstera aurea that I bought last year that I'm really unhappy with, and I'm gonna have to cut it down to the stump and try and propagate and see if I get some of the yellow back. Okay, this was a Syngonium podophyllum pink salmon. You can pour one out for your homies here. I think this is dead as dead can be. I don't even know if there's even a stump left in this thing. This was a pink salmon. I'll show you what it looks like, alive. Looks like up here. I got another one from the same seller, Syngonium podophyllum panda galaxy. Sadly, dead as well. These all rotted out. Didn't even have a chance to catch them before they died completely. And Syngoniums are pretty hardy. They can live in pretty much anything. Like I showed you that ray eye. I've got another Syngonium that's alive that I'm about to transplant that actually is aerial rooting in air in this container full of water. This is Syngonium pink spot tricolor. I believe that's what it's called. He's got aerial roots. You can see those. Can you see those right there? Just sitting over open air here. That's it. Syngoniums are hardy, and those two, the pigs, LECA drop. It's a LECA drop moment. The Panda Galaxy, both toast. And they were doing fine, and all of a sudden dropped on me. And I had them on a heat mat and everything. Very frustrating. This guy is I don't know why there's still water in here. This was a Philodendron magnum dark petiole. This was, and you can see the stump that's left in here, and it's dried out. Yeah, it's dead. Very dried out. I'll show you a picture of it alive up here. This was an Equigenera special. It's one of those plants where I think that's the second one I ordered that one, and they both died the exact same way, and I'm never touching that plant again. Philodendron magnum does not want to live as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to move on from that one and just try and take something, learn from it, that I will not buy it again, not waste my money. This one hurts particularly. This was an Anthurium crystallinum red crystal from NSC Tropicals. Yeah, it was a seedling, very small seedling. This dude was barely past like the cotyledon phase. The seed leaves, effectively. It was just barely past that. Like, I think it was maybe a centimeter tall. And this was me screwing it up because I did this LECA and moss combination thing. It just soaked the moss. Basically I had a reservoir here at the bottom in this LECA, and it stayed there and it kept soaking the moss. Instead of the moss just kind of wicking it up, it soaked. And that rotted out all the roots on my red crystal seedling until I went to take a look at it, and I was like, the top of the plant was still alive, but basically everything from the stem down was just mush. So really the leaves are the last to die on the plant. Very frustrating because I really wanted to have one of those. And thankfully I have another couple of red crystals in different states. Like I have a Zara X Michelle seedling that I'm growing out. I've got this Dock Block F2. I have something else somewhere. Oh, a Wonder Boy A seedling as well that I picked up not too long ago. Those are all variants of red crystal. So hopefully those 3 kind of start looking pretty good. And I can put this NSC red crystal behind me and not worry about it so much. A couple more dead stuff. This one particularly frustrating because it's my second one also. This was you can see by the sign here, this was a Monstera obliqua Peru, which was alive and actually had some root rot, and I trimmed it and it was coming back to life, and it sat on a heat mat that cooked it completely, and now it's mush. So that's dead. So I'm just going to toss this again. The satisfaction of tossing this into the bucket. That bucket gets a lot of use. This is dead and there's nothing left of it now, but it was alive and it was actually growing in my protected container in my tent. And very frustrating because it looked really good for a while and it was growing really well. So that was my own mistake. I let it cook on the heat mat too long and I didn't realize it had gone completely dry in this guy. And what happens when you water something that's been completely dry for too long is root rot, and it had root and stem rot at the same time, and it's dead. So that's it. That one's toast. I don't know that I'll buy another Obliqua Peru. They are, it was the it plant for a long time. I mean, look at Kaylee Allen's site. Her store uses that for a logo still. You can get them for dirt cheap now, and there's runners everywhere. And I never spent a lot of money on that plant, which is good because I think originally I had bought a runner for very cheap and tried to grow it, and I had a couple of buds on it, but then it died and dried out. And this guy I got for really cheap from Equigenera last summer or earlier this summer, because you can get them for less than $40 now. So I'm not too unhappy about that guy, but I realized that it's probably not a plant for me in this environment, so I'm just going to kind of stay away from it. This one's kind of depressing. This is, or was, there's still some green in here, so I don't know if that's just moss, to be honest. I don't know if there's anything lifelike left in there. I'm not going to open it up because it's kind of gross. You can see the dead leaves. This was Monstera albo. It was a small Monstera albo. There's so much algae in here. There's water in it. It's just rough. It was a Monstera albo that was totally white, and it had grown completely white, and I couldn't get it to go back to green without chopping it down. And it basically rotted out. The white burnt, and then the top of the plant decided to recede and die. And now I don't think there's any chance of reviving it. I'm probably going to take it out of there and take a look and see if there's any of the stem material that's still alive. Maybe I can salvage it somehow. But I do have another Monstera albo that I showed you guys in my Monstera repot video. That guy is still kicking and doing great, so I'm not super worried about losing my other one. That one came from a chonk stem cutting, and it was literally, as far as I remember, just one node with one leaf when I got it. But it went immediately white after that first leaf that was pretty well marbled, so I wasn't feeling super good about it because I kept putting out white leaf after white leaf after white leaf inside of that plastic bag, which is hilarious. This is one of those situations where maybe I just lucked out with bad genetics. It might have just been the plant itself, There's not a whole lot you can do about it, but I tried and failed. And so at least I have a replacement plant that cost me less, that is in better condition and is bigger, so I'm good with that. I'll move on from that one. And the Monstera albo is relatively easy to acquire these days, so it's not nearly as trendy as it used to be. It's one of those classic plants where I'm not super worried about, having to try and reacquire it one day. Final plant I will show you guys is this guy. This one is unlabeled, hilariously. This is dead plant number whatever we've gone through, 10, something like that. Still got roots in here. Well, I think the roots are all rotten. This guy dried out, and I don't think there's any bringing this back. I think there's a teensy bit of green up here. If I take a good look there's a little bit of green. Maybe I can propagate it if I chop that top chunk off. See, this is a good example of I could take this top chunk off. This is a Philodendron Florida Ghost. Was a Philodendron Florida Ghost that did pretty well for me, and I had actually propagated this plant earlier. So as much as it's unlabeled, I know because of the crappy structure and it's kind of popping out of the pot, I know exactly what it was because it was the only plant I had that was in this kind of weird combination of pot and orchid pot. Well before I started using those for pon. That guy's in LECA. I like most of my philodendrons in LECA. This guy, what happened was that it just did not get watered in time. The whole top rack of my rehab tent went dry at one point, and it was one of the plants that took the beating from that. It's a pretty tough plant though. But on the upside, I have this. So this guy, if you can see that, I'll see if I can open it up and show you what's inside here. That is a chonk. I think that was literally one node of the top cut that I took from that plant several months ago. It's not growing very fast because it was just a chunk. There was one stem. I think I have two or three stem cuttings in here, and they're all single node. And you can see one of them took and the other one's just dried out. That's what happens with these, they don't all take. This guy's looking really good. He's nicely got his ghosting going on there, and I think he's going to survive just fine. So Florida Ghost is a cute plant. I like it. I would have preferred it to be a Florida Beauty, but, just going to reinflate this, pop it back in my cabinet and it can stay there happily. So that's all I got plant-wise. I kind of wanted to wrap this up with a little bit of an anecdote. It kind of shows you like the full circle here of life of a plant purchaser and collector. So funny anecdote. I was talking to a guy today who's part of a plant group that I'm in. And we were just chatting on Facebook back and forth. And I think, well, there's a plant he had that I was interested in. And we started to get talking about plants that we had. And, you know, we have a lot of the same plants, or we like the same plants. And we were talking about where we got them from. And he had an NSE Wendlingeri. Funny thing. So I'm going to show you something that's kind of sad. This is a Wendlingeri I showed you guys earlier in the year. I think this is probably on its way out the door. But this was the Equigenera Wendlingeri that I got back over the summertime. And this guy was in the same condition as the Monstera obliqua, where it dried out completely and it root rotted the whole bottom of the plant, which had a number of leaves on it. It was doing quite well. And so I managed to salvage the top cut, and I don't even think that there's roots on there. I saw one little root. So I popped it into tree fern and I put a little bit of myco on there, and I'm hoping against hope that it roots. But I mean, these leaves feel kind of mushy. I need to back this up and just be like, have a fail-safe on my Wendlingeri. So I just happened to be watching this Facebook group, and a Wendlingeri popped up, an NSE Wendlingeri, which is nicer than the one I've got. It popped up for sale, and I was like, hey, that's interesting. So I looked at who was selling it, this dude I've talked to before, and we started chatting, and I asked him about the plant, kind of like going back and forth on the plant. He showed me some photos, some video. I'll see if I got a video I can show you up here. And I asked him, you know, where did you get it from? And he tells me this guy's name, and I was like, oh, that's funny. I talked to this guy like a year ago, I went to say. I searched for the names from my Facebook Messenger, and I was like, who is this dude? I know this guy's name. He's got the same name as me. I went through there and I found it, and I found the conversation. The hilarious thing is that this is a clone that I'm purchasing. The mother plant of that clone is a plant that I had originally asked to buy the year before from the same seller. Same plant. A year later, I'm getting a clone off of the same plant from a different guy who lives across the country, right? And this is all because my dying Wendlingeri kind of triggered me to go searching for another one. Just happened to be kind of casually browsing and it just popped up, right? And so like, it's funny how this whole cycle of plants, this whole cycle of life, and you're like, you know, a dead plant got me looking around. I happened to notice another plant that was similar from somebody I've talked to before. I chat with him. Turns out it's a plant that I had already expressed interest in a year ago at 3 times the price. And now I'm getting it for a third the price from the seller who has a whole bunch of them now. And it's just a funny story, but like, it shows you, like, you know, sometimes death when it comes to plants is not the end of the world, right? So don't get yourself down. Don't get depressed about dead plants. Use them as an opportunity to learn. Use it as an opportunity to grow your skills in plant care, and just to try and just generally like get better at it and feel better about it. Don't get down on yourself. I think that's the thing. It's like, whatever you see in social media, it's not reality. What you see is a facade. It's a front, right? And what you see in reality here is like dead plants. They exist. You have to deal with it. You have to live with it, and you have to get over it and move on. Use it and make yourself better. That's all I really had to say about it. I know it's kind of a long video. I was expecting this plant rant to be short. Turns into yet one of my hour-long videos, I'm sure. I'm sorry if this was a little bit on the kind of more morbid side today, you know, dead stuff, whatever. Maybe that's not everybody's cup of tea. But at the end, I think it's just useful to be prepared for it and be accustomed to having to deal with that, because it's going to happen. There's no getting around it. You know what? I think that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked it, please drop a like below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can subscribe to the channel. I post a lot of this kind of stuff regularly. I try and post regularly. Sometimes I go a little while between postings. But you know what? I've got a great community of people who have been watching these videos and enjoying them. Hopefully this kind of stuff helps you with your plant hobby and helps you feel a little bit better about yourself, and realize that, like, no, not everything is perfect out there. Not everything looks like the fancy Instagram posts that you see. There's also a lot of stuff where it's just like reality. Death is part of reality. So, you know, hope that helped. Let me know in the comments below if you have dead plants that have inspired you to do things. I would love to hear about it. Any suggestions for future videos, you can drop those in the comments below too. I respond to everything down there, and I'm sure to get back to you. So thanks again for your time. I'm Nick from Proppist. Hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one.